When the host attempted to cross swords with Elon Musk, he responded not merely sharply but was a chilling reality check. The studio air was charged, that type of tension that feels thick enough to cut with a knife. The camera's red light blinked, indicating that they were about to start a live broadcast. A liberal talk show host, with her sharp tongue and no-holds-barred approach, leaned forward in her chair, eyes locked onto the guest sitting across from her. Across from her, dressed in a simple dark blazer, was Elon Musk, with an almost eerie calm demeanor as he let his hands loosely rest on his knees. His presence was enough to be noticed, but the air throbbed with expectation as he awaited the acerbic question already hinted at in the words of the presenter. "Mr. Musk," she started steadily, but infused with a challenge at the edge of her voice, "you've been called many things: visionary, disruptor, even controversial, but some critics say your business practices and current political views are raising serious questions of ethics. How do you respond to criticism that you're putting profit over people?" Musk nodded to one side ever so slightly as the corners of his mouth came up in a faint grin. He took his time before responding, looking around the studio as if he weighed the importance of his words. "I think it's fair for people to question things," he said, his voice low but clear. "But questioning isn't the same as assuming bad intent. If we're going to talk about ethics, maybe we should start by asking who controls the narrative and why." The host blinked, taken aback by the sudden pivot. "Are you implying there's something greater going on here, beyond what you're doing?" Musk leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable weight. "Absolutely. What scares me isn't criticism, it's the control of information, how stories are constructed to drive public opinion. That's where the real danger lies." The room seemed to catch its breath. Viewers at home leaned forward in their chairs. This wasn't the way they had anticipated things to go. Musk wasn't just defending himself, he was steering the conversation into uncharted waters. As the host tried to regain control of the narrative, Musk's next words would leave her and the audience grappling with a sense of unease they couldn't shake. The host quickly regained her composure, her sharp instincts kicking in. She leaned closer, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Mr. Musk, let's not lose focus here. We're discussing your choices, people reductions at your businesses, your stance on free speech that's so open to debate, and questionable affiliations. Are you implying the pushback being directed at you as part of a scripted story?" Musk leaned back in his chair, appearing to relax, though his eyes were piercing. "I'm arguing that what people believe is, more often than not, based not on fact but on who's telling them to believe. Let's just look at the media landscape as it stands today. How often are you seeing balanced reporting? How often is a voice that disagrees with the status quo silenced or dismissed as inflammatory?" The host raised an eyebrow. "So, you're claiming you're a victim of media manipulation?" "Not just me," Musk said flatly, his voice calm but resolute. "It's bigger than me. The question isn't whether I'm a victim. The question is who decides what you believe, what you're allowed to question. When information is controlled, freedom dies. It's that simple." The host took a sharp breath, clearly trying to keep the conversation on her terms. "That's a pretty bold statement, but let's be honest, people have concerns about your platforms. Misinformation spreads like wildfire. Don't you think? Some controls are in place to do no harm." Musk's lips curled into a wry smile. "Control in whose hands? Who decides what's misinformation? I can tell you it's not as easy as people think. When you give a small group the power to determine the truth, you're giving them a weapon that can be used to suppress dissent, to stifle innovation, to control minds." The host seemed to falter for a moment, her carefully prepared questions beginning to crumble under the weight of Musk's counterpoints. Now it was the viewers in the studio and at home who could also sense the momentum changing. An interview was transpiring, all right, but this was threatening to become more of a conflict of philosophies. But still Musk had other cards to play. His last step would move the conversation away from a trade of ideas toward an accounting of conscience. He leaned forward marginally, and his eyes appeared hard and narrowed. His words became measured, each one's going. "Here's the real danger: when media and powerful institutions align, they create an illusion of consensus. They don't just control the story, they control reality. And that's when freedom isn't just at risk, it's already gone. The host shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That sounds like conspiracy talk, Mr. Musk. Are you saying there's some coordinated effort to, manipulate the world? I'm saying there's a system in place, and it's not designed for transparency or accountability. Let me give you an example, Musk said, letting the suspense hang in the air. How many times have we seen stories come out only to be debunked weeks, months, even years later? By then, the damage is done. People don't remember the correction, they remember the lie. And the ones telling those lies face no consequences. The audience was silent. The camera zoomed slightly, catching the tension in the host's expression. She tried to regain control, her voice firmer. But isn't that why platforms like your social media are under scrutiny? You allowed unchecked information to spread. Does that make you part of the problem? Musk's response was quick and calm, his words carried weight. Scrutiny is important, but it has to go both ways. When governments, corporations, and media all get together to brand dissent as misinformation, it's not about truth, it is control. That's why free speech matters, even if it's messy, because the alternative is worse. As argument after argument assembled by the host derailed and fizzled, her confidence began to sag. You're painting quite a dystopian picture, Mr. Musk, I said with a skeptical quiver. Are you basically saying there isn't any balance, that they won't find accountability? His eyes furrowed marginally. There's hope, he said softly enough, but intensely enough. But it begins with citizens questioning what's told to them, not swallowing it because the source is one they trust. We must watch out, demand openness, and not forget that liberty is something one must fight for, not just be given. His words lay heavy in the air, a silence now draped over the studio like a thick fog. For a moment, the host seemed unsure of what to say, her usual sharpness dulled by the gravity of the conversation. But the silence wouldn't last long. Musk had more to say, and what followed would force the audience to confront uncomfortable truths. Musk straightened in his chair, his demeanor shifting from conversational to resolute. Let me show you what I mean, he said, his voice firm, punctuating the quiet. Consider whistleblowers and those who speak truth to power or expose corruption. How do people treat them? They get slandered, their credibility attacked, and there's never any responsibility shown by the institution they have revealed. They leave unperturbed. The host tried to interrupt, but Musk raised his hand slightly, not in dismissal, but as a subtle gesture for her to hold her rebuttal. Let's look at surveillance programs, he continued. Years ago, people thought government monitoring of citizens was a paranoid fantasy. Then we got the leaks. We learned how deep it really went. But instead of outrage leading to accountability, it became normalized. Now people shrug it off. They say, that's just the way things are, and that's the problem. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The audience, from the studio to viewers around the globe, was on the edge of every vowel sound. Musk again leaned in, lowering his tone this time. Or take the headlines you view daily. Have you noticed how some narratives prevail and others get buried? Stories that contradict the preferred agenda are ignored, dismissed, or misinformation. The host took a deep breath, visibly wrestling with how to change direction. But isn't it the role of journalists to fact-check, to provide accurate information? Are you saying we should have no gatekeepers at all? Musk's response was measured but firm. Fact-checking is essential, but only if it's unbiased. What we have now is not fact-checking, it's selective enforcement. You don't need to shut everyone up to control a narrative, you just need to shut enough people up to make dissent seem isolated. That's how you manufacture consensus. The host finally had her opening, leaning forward with her own intensity. But isn't your own platform part of the problem? Aren't you part of the problem you're criticizing? Musk nodded slightly, acknowledging the point. Social media isn't perfect, but it's also one of the few places where people can still challenge the narrative, at least for now. The solution isn't more censorship, it's more transparency. If we start policing ideas, we lose innovation, and when innovation dies, so does progress. The room fell silent once again, the weight of the discussion palpable. The host glanced at her notes but seemed hesitant to push further. Musk pounced on the opportunity. Ask yourself this, he said, his voice softer but no less profound. How much of what you believe is something you've actually questioned, and how much is something you've just been told to believe? But before the host could even answer, Musk pivoted again, this time guiding the conversation towards the deeper connotations of unbridled control, and its entwinement with the future of human history. The host glanced nervously at the teleprompter, her confidence visibly shaken. The direction of the interview had slipped entirely out of her control, and the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. It wasn't just tense, it was unsettling. Even the studio crew, typically indifferent to the exchanges they witnessed, seemed transfixed. The only sounds that could be heard were the faint shuffling of papers and the hum of the overhead lights, breaking the heavy silence. Mr. Musk, she started, her voice cracking, you are painting a pretty bleak picture of our society. But isn't this narrative of control and manipulation just a way to deflect from your own controversies? People say your ideas and decisions have consequences, ones that you seem to conveniently ignore. Musk didn't flinch. He spoke in a calm voice, his words carrying weight that seemed to press down on the room. Criticism is fair. Accountability is necessary. But the question isn't whether I've made mistakes, we all have. The question is, who benefits when we're too distracted by controversy to see the bigger picture? Look at what's happening around us, the erosion of privacy, the consolidation of power, the suppression of voices that don't align with a specific narrative. These aren't random events, they're symptoms of a system that prioritizes control over truth. The host's jaw tightened, her frustration evident. She was a professional, accustomed to being in control of the narrative, and yet there he sat, Musk, refusing to relinquish the reins. So, what are you proposing? She snapped, her tone sharp. That we entrust ourselves to billionaires like yourself to safeguard truth? That's not replacing one form of power with another. That's still trading in power. Musk leaned back a bit, looking thoughtful. Trust isn't the answer. Transparency is. No one should have unchecked power, not governments, not corporations, not individuals. The solution is not to quiet the dissenting voices but to construct systems that will allow truth to be heard, no matter how unpalatable it may be. The host hesitated for a moment, her next move clear, but her voice had been laced with tension as she spoke. This sounds more like a warning than a conversation, Mr. Musk. It is a warning, Musk said softly, his voice almost apathetic now. Because if we don't face these questions, the price won't only be liberty, but it'll also be the future of innovation, of progress, of the very elements that make us human. It was left dangling in the air, like a whisper. Finally, for the first time ever, the host looked really and truly stumped on how to move forward. Her gaze flickered to the audience, as if searching for some semblance of control, but the expression staring back at her mirrored her own unease, confusion, curiosity, even fear. But just as the tension reached its peak, Musk delivered a final thought that shifted the focus from the present to the consequences awaiting humanity if these patterns continued unchecked. Musk shifted in his seat, his face relaxing but none of the intensity leaving it. He glanced briefly at the cameras, almost as if speaking directly to each viewer. Here's the reality, he started, his voice softer now but deep. Every decision we make, every piece of information we consume, shapes the world we leave behind. The question isn't just about power or control, it's about responsibility. Are we willing to question the narratives we're fed? Are we willing to demand better, not just from leaders and institutions, but from ourselves? The host leaned back in her chair, visibly disarmed. Her sharp demeanor had been replaced by something unfamiliar, introspection. For once, she seemed less interested in winning the argument and more in trying to understand the weight of what had just been said. Mr. Musk, she said after a long pause, you've raised some important points, but what do you want people to take away from this? What's the action they should take? Musk's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression thoughtful. I'm not here to tell people what to think, he finally said, but I do want them to think, to question, to learn, to speak up. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It's something we build brick by brick every day. And if we're not careful, the walls we think are protecting us can become the ones that trap us. The studio was heavy with silence, the weight of his words imposing themselves upon all of them. Even the host seemed subdued, her slick answers and scripted ripostes forgotten. The program had begun as another contentious interview, but it had morphed into something much deeper, a moment of shared catharsis. The closing credits started to roll, but Musk leaned into the camera one final time, his face serious. "If you've made it this far," he said, his voice softer but no less potent, "take a moment to ask yourself, who controls what you believe? And more importantly, are you willing to find out?" The screen went dark, and an entire nation was left sitting there in stunned silence. Musk's warning was not about systems of power or media manipulation, it was a call to action, a challenge to see beyond the surface and take ownership of their own beliefs. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing isn't the loss of truth, it's the loss of the will to seek it. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation that matters. If you believe in questioning the narratives and finding out the truth, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Let's keep asking the hard questions together.